Hi, welcome to a Roboflow training movie. In this training movie, I will show you how to export metadata from Cumulus to an SQL database. Before we start, working with an SQL database in Roboflow is configured and available out of the box, but of course behind the scenes, it works with the generic JDBC functionality of Java, which means that before you can start using any database, you need to install the driver for your SQL database. This could be MySQL, this could be Postgres, this could be SQL Server or Oracle or Microsoft SQL. It doesn't matter. All of these databases have a JDBC driver. Just look it up on the web, download it, and what you need to do is add it to the wrapper conf. In your wrapper conf file, which is in the conf folder of Roboflow, there you can add the name and the path to that jar and to that library, JDBC library. Then you need to restart Roboflow, and from that point on you can use it. So I've created a workflow that has as a starting point the Cumulus catalog. I want to export something from the catalog. In many cases, this could be a scheduled report, launching a query, finding some records, and exporting individual or data for all these different records that you found. So the record name, some other fields, etc. And you could export that to an SQL database. Write it in the SQL database. But in this example, we're going to do actually something different. We're going to use the query or the record that we find. We're going to use that information to query an SQL database instead of inserting an SQL database, which you can find in other training movies, and export that to a text file. So it's a little bit different than the standard logic, but could be very interesting. As an example, I have a database, a catalog in Cumulus called Reporter, in which I have records. And in these records, I have some fields that users can change. Typically, you would maybe not have the SQL query in your database if for all your records that you have there, the SQL statement is the same and just uses some fields as dynamic parameters. In that case, the SQL statement would be a parameter in your workflow. But in this case, we want to do an example where each of these records have a different SQL statement, completely different SQL statement. Probably we would hide this field for the user and only have some dynamic fields that they can set. So in this example, I'm saying, okay, whenever somebody sets here some fields that says, okay, from this period to that period, I want a report to be executed. So I have a submit request or whatever you want to call it. Notice that in this query, I have some Roboflow placeholder scripting language. I have a field, I have an SQL database in which I have some fields, and I want to do something like this. I want from a certain date to a certain date, I want to get the records. In this example, it returns 121 rows, and I want to export that information to an SQL, to a text file. So what I do here is I have my query with my placeholders in it. Notice this is a date field, and a date field by default would just give the standard full text date with Monday, July 6, or in this case, May 6, 2009. Of course, that kind of format is not very useful to query an SQL database. So you can append to that field you can append the format in which you want to export it. This is standard functionality of Roboflow. And here, because the field contains also the time, and we don't want to the user to enter the time because we have a date-only field in this example, you can append just this format for your date field. You might have, if your field in your database is a real date field, this syntax might be a little bit different. You have to look it up for your specific type of database and date time field or date field. But this example is looking at a MySQL database, and you can see that the field values are like this. So you define, and I noticed here that and this is the correct way. So I'm saying from this date, starting on the first second or millisecond of that day to the last millisecond of the end date, which is the other field I added here. So then let's go and execute the workflow. I say start. And what happens is it finds that particular record. I'll do a show log, and debug logging is enabled. So the log will be pretty extensive, but that doesn't matter. We want to, we only see a part of it because it's so extensive, doesn't matter. So it has created an export. This export is in here. And what we can see is here, it has created a tab-limited text file in this case. And so you can see that it has tabs in between the columns, and it even has added the header row, which you could or may not want. And it exports the fields that you requested to field, and it has added character return line feeds, which could just be character return if necessary. This format can be whatever you need it to be. How does it work? Well, and at the end, when it has finished, it sets this, disables this, which means that in the next query, it will not fire this. It will not execute this workflow. So you can do, you can work also whenever somebody would change this, a certain field, you could do a Roboflow trigger, which would then execute the workflow instead of this particular field. But in this example, it was just the easiest example to have a specific field. Let's have a look at the workflow itself. What I did is I have a hot collection workflow, which the starting point of that workflow is a query into the SQL database, in the, Cumulus database, or could be depending on trigger or the combination of both. So it opens the catalog, finds the records, and now we have records to process. What it will do is it will open a connection to an SQL database, which is these two parts. Then, as I said, the syntax of this is something you might need to look up into the documentation of your SQL. But this is pretty straightforward. Here's another example of a certain driver, but be careful. It all depends on the type of driver you're using. Even for MySQL, there's different drivers around, so this syntax might not even be the right syntax. Then here, the query. You could have in this workflow a fixed query. If all the queries were the same, but just the fields are different, then you could just put this query into your SQL database, and it would, when running, pick up these values. Careful, if you put them in the parameters, they should not have a hash sign here, because a hash sign tells Roboflow that this instruction needs to be executed immediately. And since it's in the parameter section, it would execute it in the parameter section, which means that the record is not there, so it would give you invalid values. That's why you see here as well, I'm picking up the values with a dollar sign, not with a hash sign. Then I configure a target folder. You can export to wherever you want. And I have a target file name. You can give it whatever file name you want. In this example, I'm I have a column value, and the column value is just a value. Why did I specify this separately? Because, for instance, if you would export this to CSV, then you might want to surround this with double quotes. In that case, you might also want to do a find and replace in the field if there's a double quote in it and escape it. Otherwise, you will end up with an invalid CSV file. And then that's also why the column separator, in this case it's a tab, but it could also be a semicolon or a comma, depending on what type of CSV you want to create. And then finally here, the row value is the concatenation of all this with a character return line feed at the end. So you could decide to also. Why this elaborate description? Because you could expand this so that it exports XML. So that too is a possibility. Good. Then after the processing, I will want to set some field values, and in this case only one. So I have the field name here and the value, so that it's only exporting once. And I have integrated a little parameter that says, do you want to export the header, the column names, or not? If you set it to false, it won't. If you set it to true, it will. Let's have a technical look in the background of this workflow. When the workflow executes the query, it will then run this workflow for each, it will run this script for each record found. The first thing I do is I test if this is the first record. If it's the first record, I'm going to open the database, and I'm giving the name a hash global hash because it needs to persist, it needs to exist throughout all records being processed. Otherwise, if you don't do this, it will just exist in this loop. But since we're only opening it for the first record, then the second record, this object would not exist. Then I'm storing the SQL statement. So this is going to execute this, where is it, my SQL? So it's going to pick up that field value, which is going to result in the query. I'm enabling debug. I'm enabling debug logging, which actually could easily be disabled again once you have it running as a fully tested script. And then your export, so it's going to say, I'm going to do this query. So that's what you can do. And then it's creating the target export. Then it's performing the SQL statement. And then it's testing, do I want to export the header? If I do, I process the rows of that header. I'm saying here are the columns, not the rows, sorry, the columns, and I'm writing this to the text file. Then I'm processing the rows of the table. So internally, the SQL statement stores it as a table. In Java, it's called a hash table, or you could call it a hash map if you want. And then it's processing those rows. Each row is actually an array with all the elements, all the columns. So once it has processed all the rows, for each row, it will have a counter just to write, hey, I'm processing row 1, 2, 3. And then it will process the columns from a row, which is then outputting it as a column. And then if you have a look, it will store column value, which means that I'm picking up the column value. That's because I want to evaluate that particular value. Make sure that you keep that name here because I'm using it here, just column value, because you might want to, as I said before, do some fancy quoting or whatever you want to put around it. Maybe you want to make a HTML export out of it and you want to surround it with smaller than TD, bigger than, etc. And then at the end, smaller than /TD. And so you might want to export it HTML or even XML. Then I'm testing if the row is not empty. If it's not empty, then I'm going to add the column separator. Remember that we want this to have tab, 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 whatever. So you cannot start with a tab, you can only add it when it's the first element, and that's when the row that it is building is still empty. And then, and here it is, as I said, it has picked up the column value here from column, and then here it is adding that row value, and so it is picking up that row value, and then it's writing it to the text file. And so row value plus column value. And then when it gets out of this loop, it will it will write that line to the text file, and it will add a notification in the logging if debug is enabled. And then finally, when all rows are processed, it will set that record field value, and then it tests if it's the last record of the loop. If it's the last item processed, then it will close the database. So a very straightforward, easy to use workflow, and it gives you an export result, a tab limit text file, or CSV file, or an XML file. If it needs to be something like an XML file, at this point there is no prefix of the XML element, so you might have to modify the workflow saying that you have something before and something after, where you could have something like a container and the XML tag in front. But in this case, it was merely an example of how to create a tab-limited text file or a CSV file. So, thank you for joining this training movie, and hope to see you in the next one.